In 2019, a new Scooby-Doo theatrical release was announced 15 years after the last time some of us were forced to leave the house to see the Mystery Inc. gang on the big screen. The CG animated Scoob film was to be the first in a proposed Hanna-Barbera cinematic universe, with future films planned featuring other old properties like the Flintstones and Wacky Races. You would think a Scooby fan like myself would have been excited, and you'd be wrong. Any positive feelings I had for the Scoob film were immediately dashed after learning the producers pulled another Judy Jetson maneuver. Back in the late 1980s, Hanna-Barbera released a theatrical film based on The Jetsons, one of the studio's early animated sitcoms from the 1960s about a family living in the future world of the 2060s where everyone still uses paper money and black people don't seem to exist. It was decided to bring back as many of the show's original voice actors as possible, and for a few, it was a near miss. Dawes Butler, the original voice of Elroy, ironically the family's youngest member, died before production began, while both George O'Hanlon and Mel Blanc, the voices of George Jetson and his boss Mr. Spacely respectively, died during production. Fortunately, the remaining original principal cast survived to complete their recording sessions. Penny Singleton as Jane Jetson, Don Messick as Astro, Jean Vanderpyle as Rosie the Robot, and Janet Waldo as Judy Jetson. Who the f*** is Tiffany? I'll save you a Google search. Tiffany was a teen pop singer whose fame began in 1987 with her cover of the Tommy James and the Shondells hit, I Think We're Alone Now, from 2 decades earlier. Unfortunately for her, 1987 was also the peak of Tiffany's career. Showing the same sense of excellent timing that led to the creation of a beatnik character 15 years after the height of the Beat generation, Hanna-Barbera decided to leap on what was clearly the next big thing for teenagers: mall singers. So they replaced Janet Waldo, who already recorded Judy Jetson's lines, with Tiffany, making what could have been the bittersweet swan song for the original cast of a beloved 1960s cartoon animated sitcom into little more than a cynical and failed cash grab of stunt casting. I understand that most people don't really care about what goes on behind the scenes of television and film productions. All they care about is what appears on screen, and if the cast and crew faced a nightmare of technical and legal issues, executive meddling, or temperamental stars abusing everyone on the set, they'll shrug and say, "Who cares?" I care. At least, I care enough that it makes it hard for me to enjoy watching an actor deliver an incredible performance if I know just off camera is a production assistant crying their eyes out and contemplating suicide because the millionaire playing pretend threatened to have them fired because their Starbucks order had 1 extra squirt of soy milk. For the last 4 decades, my favorite fantasy Hollywood career path has been voice acting. Before that, it was being a special effects technician into learning about how much math was involved. I'm one of those nerds who can usually recognize the voices I hear in cartoons and commercials and put a face to almost all the most popular voiceover artists, often to the point of recognizing them on the rare occasions they appear on camera in minor roles. Like a rabid sports nut following the career path of their favorite athletes, I do the same for my favorite voice actors, cheering when they're cast in popular roles and booing when they're treated poorly by studios. And wow, have voice actors been treated poorly by studios. The history of voice acting has been fraught with lousy pay, strenuous working conditions, and long hours. To add insult to injury, actors often went uncredited or had their contributions minimized. It's only been since the 1990s that the people voicing our childhood started to become recognized. Look at most cartoon series from decades prior, and with a few exceptions, none of the talent received a name to credit for the characters they voiced. Instead, principal cast members were usually lumped together with anyone else who happened to voice a guest character at any point during the entire season. Take this example from the closing credits of a Smurfs episode. Can you tell just by looking who voiced Papa Smurf, Brainy, or Smurfette? Of course, not all voice actors toiled in obscurity. Most people know who Mel Blanc was. After all, he was easily the most famous cartoon voice artist who ever lived, but that's only because he fought for screen credit, which purportedly he only got because the producers gave him that instead of a pay raise. Older voice actors were often paid so poorly that they jealously guarded their roles, and many abided by a gentleman's agreement not to assume a part traditionally played by another actor unless absolutely necessary. In other words, if a role is being cast and the original actor was still alive and working, it was considered somewhat taboo for anyone else to play the part. Not that this didn't happen from time to time, but in general, that was one of the reasons why the same actors usually played the same part time and time again. This fear of being recast was confirmed by an acquaintance of mine who had been doing cartoon roles since the 1960s. One of his good friends was a famous announcer who became seriously ill and started to have difficulty performing. Even though they were friends, the announcer refused my acquaintance's offer to temporarily fill in for him while he recovered. The announcer preferred showing up to work with a terminal illness than risk losing his job. A good source for behind-the-scenes stories is Mark Evanire's personal blog. Among many other things, Evanire worked in the cartoon industry for decades and is a treasure trove of anecdotes and explanations. While conditions have improved for voiceover artists over the years, there is sadly still a long way to go. Most industry reforms have been due to the work of labor unions, but even among their ranks, voice actors are still often treated like second-class citizens. Take one of the most recent voice actor strikes. This particular walkout focused on video game work. Chief among the strikers' demands were residuals, being told the actual project they were working on, and how strenuous the recording sessions would be. For those unaware, residuals are payments received by actors after their original performance. The way it typically works is an actor first gets paid a set amount up front, and after that, they receive additional smaller fees based on how much income the production generates over time. This typically includes things like box office earnings, television airings and syndication deals, home video rentals and sales, and more recently, streaming services. Residuals are essentially a form of deferred payment. You'll get a smaller amount up front for the promise of more money later on. Thus, some of the risk for financing an expensive production is shared between the producers and portions of the cast and crew. This not only allows more of the budget to be spent on making the final product look and sound better to increase the odds of success, but it also adds an incentive for everyone to give the best performance they can. Residuals can potentially turn a single acting gig into decades of checks, and the more roles that offer residuals an actor takes, the more they will add to their net worth over their entire career. The occasional big paydays are nice, but residuals are what often keep most working actors fed between roles. For an industry with annual revenues well over $100 billion, video game residuals for voice actors is an obvious step, especially when considering the film industry has been struggling to reach half that amount for years. In addition to residuals, when negotiating contracts with a game studio, it's helpful for the actor or their agent to have a good idea as to the value of the role. AAA titles and their sequels will obviously generate more revenue than a budget indie release on Steam. The last thing an actor wants is to get paid scale for a role they were told was merely a strong female, only to find out later they were working on the next installment in a billion-dollar franchise. Finally, it's a common misconception that voice actors merely sit comfortably in front of a mic and read from a script. While sometimes the case, there is usually more to a performance than that. First of all, the better actors do actually get physical during recording in order to bring out their best performance. In addition, they often spend hours in a booth repeating the same lines of dialogue over and over until the voice director is satisfied with a take. They also record grunts, screams, and other sounds related to the actions of their video game counterpart. This can be exhausting work. put it in perspective, I'm just a schmuck recording videos in front of a smartphone camera. Despite this, even one of my 10-minute YouTube uploads usually represents an hour or more of actual recording time. By the end, my back hurts from standing in the same spot for so long, my lips and throat are dry despite constantly drinking water, and my Fitbit records over 2,000 steps from simply gesticulating to keep my performance looking animated. By the time I'm done recording, I'm ready to drop and don't even want to look at another script. And that's just me, as an amateur, doing this as a hobby. Imagine being a professional voice artist whose entire livelihood depends on spending 8 hours or more in a booth. Or worse, spending hours in a booth during an early morning session at one studio before driving across town to another for several more hours of recording, followed by even more time spent at yet another studio for an evening session. Now imagine your morning performance was spent shouting dialogue or performing grunts for a video game. Your larynx is in shreds, but you still have 4 to 6 more hours of recording scheduled that same day. My voice actor acquaintance once read for a popular 1980s cartoon series with a notorious director known for putting his talent through the ringer. After a single session where he was forced to shout almost every line, my acquaintance immediately quit because his voice wouldn't be in any shape for the more lucrative radio and television commercials he was scheduled to do. If an actor knows ahead of time a role is going to involve enough exertion to not only be painful, but also impact potential future earnings, they would either reject the part or demand more money to compensate for lost income.
Knowledge is power!
It's Schoolhouse Rocky, the chip off the block of your favorite Schoolhouse Rock.
So the biggest demands from the 2016-2017 voice actor strike was paying residuals to voice actors, being told what games they would be recording so they'd have a better idea as to the role's worth, and what physical demands would be required. After negotiations, their labor union returned triumphantly with a sliding scale of bonuses up to $2,100 for up to 10 or more studio session recordings, and the ability for the actors to know roughly the kind of role they were recording, and if it was perhaps a sequel, but not the actual game title or series itself. Oh, but they did get assurances that the industry would continue looking at the vocal stress some roles cause to the actors and maybe perhaps think about addressing this issue in the future. Possibly. While this example focuses on video games and not traditional film and television cartoon roles, it does illustrate how voice actors are commonly treated as serfs in the Hollywood feudal system, even by the organizations whose sole purpose is to look out for their best interests. Hell, even when there's residuals, it still doesn't keep voice artists from getting screwed. After one of his old series became available in a DVD box set for the first time, I asked my acquaintance if he was excited, only for him to shrug and say he couldn't care less because he would never see a dime from it. I was mortified because I'd assumed he was getting residuals. Oh, he assured me that yes, he was supposed to get residuals, but because of how the contract worked for that particular series, he was only going to see payments after a ridiculous number of copies sold first. Once that goal was reached, then he'd only get a few pennies per sale from that point on. He then confided that even if the DVDs were massively successful, he still likely wouldn't see any payment because he had no way of verifying sales. He tried to get this information in the past, but the rights to the older series kept getting sold over and over again, so he couldn't pin down who even owed him the money in the first place. Worse, these companies often keep their transfers confidential, so it would take a court order to find out who even to sue. When it costs more in legal fees to collect the monies owed than the original amount due in the first place, it's simply not worth pursuing. The shoddy way my acquaintance was treated is doubly frustrating for me because I've always been a cartoon voice nerd, and when the unlikely opportunity arose for me to befriend a veteran of the industry, he was so disgusted by that point he had no desire to talk about his experiences. Which brings us back to 2020's Scoob. And this tweet by Matthew Lillard, the actor who played Shaggy in the live-action early 2000s theatrical films, and who has been voicing the animated version of the character since 2010, becoming Shaggy in a way that for many has surpassed Casey Kasem's original performance. Well, this sucks. What a crappy way to find out. Thanks, Hollywood. you never cease to amaze me. Or this tweet by Grey Delisle Griffin, who has been voicing Daphne for almost twice as long as Lillard has been voicing Shaggy. People keep asking what I think of Scoob, and honestly, I probably won't ever be able to watch it. I'm certainly not saying that you shouldn't, but to listen to someone else doing the voice I've done for over 20 years is just too painful for me. Jeepers, I'm sorry. With the exception of Frank Welker's Scooby, every beloved actor who had been bringing the Mystery Inc. gang to life for several series and direct-to-video films were not only replaced for the new theatrical release, but the studio didn't even respect them enough to let them know ahead of the cast announcement. Rather than using the established voices we've come to know and love, the producers decided to go for big name recognition. Or at least who they thought was big name. Will Forte? Seriously, Warner Brothers? I mean, if you managed to snag Brad Pitt to voice Shaggy, I could understand. But you all over Matthew Lillard? For MacGruber? Yes, I know most of the Scooby Gang have had multiple actors over the past 5 decades, but generally this was due to decisions made by the actors themselves not to return, whether due to lack of interest, retirement, conflicting ideology, or sadly passing away. Sometimes followed by having their widow play keep away with their corpse. A lot of this Scooby-Doo franchise is hit and miss. For every Mystery Incorporated, there's a Get a Clue. For every Zombie Island, there's a Return to Zombie Island. For every 13 Ghosts, there's a Curse of the 13th Ghost. I know my refusal to buy a digital copy of Scoob is not going to make a dent on the studio's ledger, and some will find it stupid for anyone to care that much about actors they'll probably never meet in person. Obviously, one fan's boycott will have little to do with the success of any film. However, looking at the Rotten Tomatoes score, Scoob was not a huge success with either critics or the audience. And indeed, plenty of reviews mentioned the casting choices. It's also likely that Forte and the rest were paid a lot more for their performances than Lillard, Delisle Griffin, Welker, or Micucci would have commanded. So not only was it a critical misfire to recast, it was a financial one as well. The money they spent on big names did not seem to translate to sales. It's difficult not to feel just a little bit of schadenfreude over that fact, nor a bit of hope that studio executives might learn their lesson for future casting decisions. Then again, if studio executives could learn from their mistakes, they wouldn't be studio executives. Well, this sucks! What a crappy way to find out! Thanks, Hollywood! You never cease to amaze me! Yeah, no, I can't do Shaggy. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. There is more Scooby-Doo related content on my channel, and let's face it, if you're here, you're likely a Scooby fan. I also cover other subjects, so please check them out as well.